we now move on to our final panel, which we have Yvonne and Sarah. All right, we'll start with Yvonne's presentation, then move on to Sarah's. Okay.
I will share my screen then. Go. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Yvonne Thomason. Today I will be discussing the Sampo generation in South Korea and the contributing economic and social factors that have gone into this social phenomena. So firstly, I'd just like to briefly go over the state of Korea's economy right now. Obviously, Korea has one of the highest GDPs in the world, but their economy is mostly dominated by large conglomerates or chaebols, and the country is known for workers having very long hours, and there's an increasing part-time job market. And with these rising economic trends, we have also seen a sharp decrease in birth rate and marriage rate in South Korea. And a new term has been coined called the Sampo sedae, or the Sampo generation. And this generation in South Korea includes South Korean young millennials and teenagers who have seemingly given up on dating, marriage, and childbirth. And there's a lot of research going into why that is the case right now, because it's having a large impact on South Korea's population. As you can see, the population of elderly Koreans has sharply increased in the last few years. And along with that trend, the number of children in Korea has also significantly decreased, which is a massive problem, because if this trend continues into the future, South Korea will reach the situation where the number of working age people cannot support the elderly generation. So my question was, what is contributing to this generation? Why are they not getting married, having kids, dating? And for that, as my methodology, I turned to scholarly analysis of articles published on the economics going on in Korea, but I also wanted to combine it with a review of what members of the Sampo generation themselves have to say about the situation. So for that, I turned to a review of mass media, mainly music, Korean dramas, and movies that are either made by the Sampo generation or about the Sampo generation. So just going into a brief historical overview of how South Korea's economy has grown and how the Sampo generation has come to be. I started my analysis in the 1950s in the post-Korean War period. Obviously, during the Korean War, there was a massive destruction of Korean infrastructure. Farms were damaged. Businesses were damaged. Korea split into the South and the North. And then it really was in a dire straits in terms of economics until in the 1960s when Park Chung-hee took over the country. That's when we really started to see the takeover of massive conglomerates and investment into key factors in the Korean economy. And that's when we really start to see Korea's economy take off. And it's a massive growth up until the late 1990s with the IMF economic crisis. And during this period, unemployment reached a record high, and we start to see a bit of a shift that I will go into in a second in terms of Korean education and Korean work culture. And then here, going into the 2010s is when we start to see the trend of having a lot of youth unemployment and the birth rate problem that I've discussed. So the first part economic study of what is going on with the Sampo generation included the economic side of why they cannot marry and have children and date. And in my research, I concluded that it mainly had to do with post-IMF economic trends and work culture in conglomerates. And it's mostly because conglomerates in Korea make up a massive part of the economy. And also because they are prestigious places to work, the demand for jobs in the conglomerates has led to an increasingly high amount of competition in the workforce, which then has influenced Korea's education system, which is putting strain on the teenagers in the Sampo generation. I argue that this mostly has to do with a term called compressed modernity, which is what was seen in South Korea. And compressed modernity is, in a nutshell, is basically that Korea's economy grew so rapidly and so fast that it unconsciously led to a generation where economic success was starting to be seen as the main goal for society. The economy grew faster than people had time to consciously cope with the change in the country. And that's led to this idea that in order to be successful in life, you have to get in to these conglomerates because they provide the most career prestige and also the highest salaries and more stable jobs. So that, I argue, has contributed to what I'm calling the spec generation in Korea, where the younger generation, they're so focused on getting the best specs or the best characteristics and things to add to their resume. And so the younger members of the Sampo generation are not dating and not getting married and things because they're so focused on competition for economic success. And this relates to their education as well. And this is where my media analysis starts to come into play, because as a way to look at the influence on the Sampo generation, I decided to use the group BTS as a case study, because a lot of their music is written about education in Korea and how that's affecting youth. And as you can see here, they're saying that youth have been made into study machines, and they're so driven by societal expectations to do well, that all they're concerned about is trying to get the best education, the best possible job that they can. And this extends into their parents' role in their education as well, because the young members of the Sampo generation have been so pushed to perform well in their education and in terms of getting a job, that they themselves have now begun to, for lack of a better word, buy into it and take an active role in the competition. And this then puts more strain on their parents, because with the education comes paying for the cost of their education and paying for maintaining social standing, which also puts economic strain on their parents. Like, as you can see from these lyrics, they're not only expected to go to school and pay for that education, but they're also expected to pay for things like expensive jackets so they can fit in with their friends. All of this competition has led to a very polarized society where there is this expectation of economic success that people strive for, but they can rarely attain. And this is partly displayed in the movie Parasite. In the movie, the Park family They're extremely wealthy. They have a very high economic status, and it's very sharply juxtaposed to the Kim family, where the young members of the Kim family, I argue, embody the Sampo generation. They have part-time jobs, they have a low socioeconomic status, and the movie is about them constantly wanting to attain even a bit of the Park's lifestyle, but they're just unable to get this success in life. And the fact that they have this low socioeconomic status also in the movie prevents them from being able to date and marry. Like the son of the Kim family, he is told that he won't be a good dating partner for the daughter of the Kim family because of his economic status. Also playing into the Sampo generation
Yvonne,
is
Yvonne, yeah, we're
yes.
past 10 minutes, so do you want to skip to your conclusion?
Okay, thank you, sorry. So in conclusion, the government has tried to better the economic situation for the Sampo generation by including tax cuts to encourage dating and to encourage marriage and childbirth. But I argue that this isn't really enough because the problem is not purely economic. So they need to focus on changing societal expectations as well if we want to see a change. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. I think we have time for a question.
Oh, do I not go or?
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah, Sarah.
Okay, sounds good. So my earbuds are not working. Do you perhaps hear an echo through this? Because that wouldn't be great.
No, you sound good.
Okay. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah, and I'm a senior at the George Washington University. Today, I'll be discussing my research, which concerns the bilateral relations between Japan and South Korea. So, Japan and South Korea are both democracies, geographic neighbors, and American allies, so it seems more than natural that they would have already forged a strong partnership. But nonetheless, time has not at all healed old wounds when it comes to these countries, and to say the least, periodic conflicts have only stoked the fires of nationalism. My research explored one possible area of cooperation, and that is the cultural arena. This is part of my larger senior thesis project, which examined the causal relationship between sociocultural interactions and public attitudes, and also how the history problem perhaps undermined the positive effects of cultural contact. But for the sake of my GWIX paper, I focused only on the first two variables, with the overarching question as, have sociocultural interactions improved public attitudes in Japan and South Korea? Unfortunately, feelings of animosity still define their bilateral relationship, but there's perhaps a silver lining. This is where I formally introduce the cultural domain. We see the widespread prevalence of the Korean wave through K-pop and K-drama, as my peers have mentioned in their presentations. And likewise, there is the Cool Japan initiative that's showing signs of influence in South Korea, because cuisine and animation are quite popular there. In theory, if we apply the concept of soft power coined by Joseph Nye, which promotes the strength of attraction over coercion, then these cultural exchanges as two-way informational experiences should have fostered mutual understanding. But in absence of that reality, my research challenged that assumption. With regards to my empirical strategy, the independent variable was the level of sociocultural interactions. And then my research treated the Japanese and South Korean public attitudes as the dependent variable. And concerning my time frame, my research covered the years from 1988 to 2019. The first part of my research was an analysis of sociocultural interactions, and these are derived from research organizations and official reports by government agencies in Japan and South Korea. I collected an array of data covering the flow of cultural goods as well as people-to-people exchanges. Access to the relevant data was quite limited, unfortunately, and that accounts for the asymmetry of information. It did not go through a rigorous statistical test. None of the indicators were consolidated into a single chart, but each one of them was represented by a chart so that I could accurately and readily assess any trends and patterns. I found that there was a general increase in sociocultural interaction since 1998, when South Korea officially lifted its ban on Japanese cultural imports as a result of the Obuchi-Kim summit. And the second finding was that there was an imbalance in the exchange of cultural goods in favor of South Korean exports, but in terms of people-to-people exchanges, more South Koreans visited Japan than vice versa. Due to the time constraints, I will be showing only a couple of the graphs that I've compiled through this research. The first one illustrates the imports and exports of South Korea's broadcasting industry. Overall, there was an increase from 2000 to 2010, despite a slight drop in the end. The following graph depicts the trends in Japanese tourism. Although there were a couple of fluctuations and large drops, especially from 2012 to 2015, the total of Japanese tourists in South Korea generally increased. Compared to the previous graph, this one has less fluctuations. So South Korean tourism was by and large a lot greater than Japanese tourism, and though the numbers oscillated a tad from 2008 to 2011, South Korean tourism to Japan skyrocketed since 2011. Shifting to the second part of my research, I conducted an analysis of public attitudes in Japan and South Korea based on polling data. I understand that polls are an imperfect tool of measurement, but they still offer valuable insights into civil society, and they were just sufficient to map out the larger trends. One finding was that, for the most part, more than 50% of South Koreans held negative attitudes toward Japan. Second, Japanese public attitudes were not as severe as those of South Koreans, and they were largely neutral or positive up until 2012. Again, here I'll present only some of the data that I found. Based on this poll by Gallup, unfavorable impressions of Japan reached its height in 2005 at 79%. And in 2011, a record high of 41% held positive views, but please note that this is still below the 50% threshold. However, from 1991 to 2019, South Korean impressions of their counterpart deteriorated. This graph portrays the level of Japanese affinity towards South Korea. While the feelings of affinity were above the 50% mark until 2010, the percentage of Japanese who didn't feel any affinity took the lead after 2011, hovering at about 60% of the respondents. Still, it's been less than the negative attitudes very prevalent among South Koreans. I then looked at the two variables together. There were transitory moments of correlation. From the late 1990s to early 2000s, South Korean attitudes improved alongside an increase in Japanese cultural imports. And then from 2009 to 2012, an increase in sociocultural interactions was in conjunction with enhancements in public attitudes. But I do want to add as a side note that during these two periods, when sociocultural interactions increased and public attitudes improved, disputes over history were quite subdued. Nevertheless, there was no clear pattern between the two variables. Enhancements in public attitudes were not sustained despite the expansion of sociocultural interactions, and unfortunately, public attitudes in both countries were quite poor. So, some concluding remarks. In conclusion, this research shows that an increase in sociocultural interactions did not rectify the antagonistic views of one another, but it doesn't reach the oversimplified conclusion that sociocultural interactions have no positive impact. It doesn't dismiss the possibility of another variable that perhaps undermined or mitigated the positive effects, and these could include history, security, and the media. In fact, my senior thesis incorporated the history problem as an intervening variable between the sociocultural interactions and the level of public attitudes. Nevertheless, I believe that sociocultural interactions still have the power to improve attitudes and can facilitate bilateral cooperation in the end. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Yvonne and Sarah. All right, we'll have, we can take questions. Yes, Toby?
I have a question for Sarah. I was wondering, excuse me, what you thought about the recent, like last summer with the anti-Japanese sentiment kind of going around Korea, and how that you thought that affected the relationships you were talking about in your presentation.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I thought that last summer's incidents were quite the anomaly because usually Japan and South Korea, they really compartmentalize economics and politics, but last summer it showed otherwise. I think once again, it proves that historical disputes are constantly the obstacle that prevents sociocultural interactions and their cultural influence from really taking its course. And that is just a case in point at a whole new, very antagonistic level.
Okay.
I wanted to ask a question for Yvonne, if that's possible. Which is, Yvonne, I think you're working on a very fascinating and relevant project, and I was curious because your framing is very much about sort of South Korea's trajectory economically and socially, but I was curious because there's some trends here that seem to be really international. There's some issues that South Korea is facing that places like Japan are facing, the United States is also starting to face, and there's been a lot of research kind of internationally on why young people are giving up some of these things. I know in the Japanese case, a lot of that's focused on lack of support for working parents, in particular working mothers. And I was curious, you know, in the research you did there seemed to be kind of a resonance between these international cases, you know, sort of how much do the factors appear to be purely domestic versus in conversation with these larger trends around the world?
Yeah, very much so. So I had to skip over a couple of parts, but part of my argument was going into, like you said, support for working mothers. It's very much the same case, both in Japan and Korea. One of the policies that the Moon presidency has implemented is building more daycares, either within a firm or very close to companies, so that mothers can drop their kids off during the day. And also some tax incentives for them to take maternity leave and have more children. But part of my argument was that it's partly economic, but the social side of it is that in a lot of Korean conglomerates, the women aren't really encouraged to take maternity leave because they have a work culture where if you leave, your coworkers have to pick up the slack of the work that you're not doing. So that's a huge incentive for them to say, do I want to keep my career or do I want to have kids? It kind of makes them choose one or the other. And I feel like it's kind of the same situation, like you were saying, in Japan and also in a couple of other countries abroad. So that's a factor.
Thank you.
Yes, Summer?
I have a question for Sarah. So I was wondering, through your research, if you found that there were perhaps generational gaps or certain demographic trends that caused a difference between perhaps generations or genders in attitudes and impressions?
That's an excellent question because there are definitely demographic components in this. For instance, in the beginning of the Korea boom in Japan, it only reached middle-aged women because of the Winter Sonata drama. But then later on, it became more popular among the young demographics. That same trend also applies to South Korea. Nevertheless, again, they separate culture and history. And as long as the history problem persists, that cultural part remains irrelevant in their bilateral relations. I hope that answers your question, though.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, Yono?
One question for Ivana and another question for Sarah. Ivana, in your analysis, I wonder if the collapse of middle class in South Korea after the so-called IMF crisis, and also the generational change, their values, how much values they put in marriages, that kind of factors. I wonder how much of importance did you find in analyzing your topic? And for Sarah, the social cultural interactions, I wonder if it is also part of public's attitude toward the Korea-Japan relations rather than an independent variable. Wouldn't it be also a dependent variable? Thank you.
I guess I'll go first. So again, I'm sorry I had to skip over so many parts of my presentation, but yes, during the post-IMF crisis period in my research, I did come across, this is where I found the sort of Korea's economy started to begin to shift, with the middle class did start to recede either into a large upper class or a large middle class, a large lower class. The division was what I was trying to talk about with, there's the expectation of socioeconomic status and success, but so many people are unable to attain it. And instead they have to just focus on, their daily survival and their daily being able to care for their own needs. But I'm so sorry, sir. What was the second part of your question?
The generational change, the younger generation's value on a marriage.
Yeah. So another part of my presentation was the alternatives that we have found instead of dating, marriage, and childbirth. There is a generational shift where a lot of younger Koreans are like, okay, I either can't support a family or I'm too busy to support a family. So a lot of them will be fine with either just casual dating or maybe getting married but not having children. There is a shift in attitudes because they just are so focused on their own economic survival. They've started to be okay with letting go of more traditional values that their parents or their grandparents had in terms of having kids and getting married.
Hey, Professor Kim, I'm sorry if I didn't understand your question properly. Were you saying whether the sociocultural interaction should be the dependent variable instead?
I think it could be both. Could be independent, and also like it could be results or consequences of other important events going on between the two countries.
Of course. So for the sake of my research for senior thesis, I treated the other events as an intervening variable because I wanted to focus on the flow of the sociocultural interactions. I've always heard from professors and other diplomats in Japan and South Korea saying, oh, we have a lot of cultural contact, face-to-face exchanges. This should eventually lead to a positive environment for cooperation. But from what I saw, there was a lack of empirical evidence to confidently make that assumption. So I wanted to make the theme of my research only on the sociocultural interactions, which have not changed, which we could clearly see an increase of since 1998. But when I do continue this research later in my master's or perhaps PhD, I will definitely consider that in the future.
All right. Any other questions? Maybe one last question. No? Okay. Maybe I have a comment for, well, I don't know whether it's a comment or question, but to Yvonne. So I think, as Russell mentioned, this is not just, I think this issue is not just limited to Korea, but I think in Korean context, there's more, distinctive distinctive factors that we need to take into consideration. And well, of course, like as you've shown in Parasite, like the polarization is one issue that's becoming a big problem right now. But I think one of the reasons for young couples not trying to avoid getting married or having children has to do with housing issue, because housing is just so super expensive. And second, it's also about education, because to have a child, it really means you need to be able to invest so much in your child's education. So it's not like you can just give up. So because it's just so it's the general attitude towards education is also same in South Korea. Everybody needs high education, and they all need to go to sky universities. That's the goal. And so it just requires so much investment in their children's education, which I think that especially education part can kind of distinguish from other places. And then of course there's also gender issues that we can think of. So maybe I'm glad that you're, this is a economy issue, but you're really trying to, expand and trying to look at socioeconomic factors. But what other issues, because we didn't really get into the latter part of your presentation, I would like to ask, what are some of the other factors that you're considering in your research project?
Definitely. My biggest factors were the education and the cost of raising children that you just talked about. I did go into the women's role in it, and how, like I mentioned to Professor Berg, that they're just not encouraged to take maternity leave. So it's made this generation of women who are like, do I want a career or do I want a family? There's the polarization of it's next to impossible for them to have both. And then I mostly went into the alternatives that we've seen, the alternatives to getting married and having kids. I talked about a drama about people who are Sampo generation age, where all of the couples, either they don't get married or they don't have children, or they decide to live with their relatives instead of owning their own home. They've all given up something. They've found it impossible to economically sustain a family or have time to have a family. That's mostly what I talked about. I tried to make it so that we see the economic history that's led to this situation, as well as the uniqueness of Korea's society that has compounded on the pre-existing economic issue. That's what I was trying to argue.
All right, well, thank you. Okay, so if we don't have any other questions, I think we'll move on to closing remarks. Well, since Seung-Kyung is not here, I think I'll just make a brief final remarks, and we'll end the conference. But first of all, I would like to thank all of IU and GW students for having done a great job in writing your papers. I know it took a lot of time and effort throughout the academic year. It's not just this semester. I know at least for GW students, we started meeting early in the fall, and then, continuously did the workshops, monthly workshops, and, revisions, and just, put so much effort into writing these papers. So kudos to all of you. And then also I would like to thank our faculty members, of course, IU faculty members as well, for helping our students write these great papers. And well, we encourage our students to publish their papers submitted to undergraduate or graduate journals, so that these papers can be published. And I think it's a great opportunity for you guys to do that. And if you need further help, I'm sure our faculty members will be willing to help with that as well. We should have gone to Tipuri, right? Like a dinner reception after this, but obviously we won't be able to do that. So hopefully after this, you can just, have I don't know whether you guys are, I think, all above drinking age, but have a toast and for yourself and enjoy your dinner. But anyways, thank you so much for your work. And I don't know how things will work out next year, but you know, Seung-Young and Keith will definitely be in touch, and we'll figure out what we can do for next year. I mean, hopefully, if you know, things don't seem to improve, we would continue to do this virtual conference. But hopefully by next year, things will be better, and we'll be able to, you know, meet in person and congratulate each other. All right, thank you very much, and hope have a great evening. And well, I know IU is over with your semester. Have a wonderful summer, and same with our students. Have you know, good luck with your finals, and have a wonderful summer as well. All right, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Mine and Keith, thanks for your, you know, work as well.